There is a moment in The Invisible Man where absolutely nothing happens, and it is the single most frightening scene in the entire film. No monster lunging from the dark. No jump scare. No sudden music sting designed to spike your heart rate. Just a woman lying in bed at 3 a.m, completely still, staring at the ceiling, while the camera drifts slowly toward an empty corner of the room. And somehow, in that silence, in that total emptiness, you feel it. Something is in that room. You cannot see it. You cannot point to it. But somewhere below conscious thought, your body has already registered the threat before your brain catches up. That instinct, that primal, unshakable dread triggered by the absence of anything visible, is the engine that powers every single minute of this film. And the fact that director Leigh Whannell built a 2-hour psychological thriller almost entirely on that one feeling and sustained it without breaking is something that deserves far more credit than this movie typically gets in casual conversation. In this video, we are taking a detailed look at The Invisible Man, not just as a horror film, but as a complete cinematic experience that brings together psychological terror, survivor trauma, and one of the most disciplined directorial visions the genre has produced in the last decade. This is a movie that turns every frame into a potential threat, that uses ambient sound and deliberate silence as carefully as any composer uses notes, and that demands more from its lead actress than most prestige dramas would dare to ask. At the center of all of it is Elisabeth Moss, delivering a performance so physically committed, so emotionally precise, that somewhere around the midpoint of this film it genuinely stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like testimony. Quick heads up before we go further, we are going deep on this one, full spoilers included, so if you have not seen The Invisible Man yet, this is a good moment to bookmark this video and come back once you have. You will get a lot more out of this breakdown if you have already lived through the experience once. Before anything else, it is worth establishing exactly what kind of film The Invisible Man actually is, because a lot of viewers in 2020 walked in expecting something closer to the classic Universal monster movie tradition and walked out having experienced something that operates on an entirely different frequency. This is not a film about a creature. It is a film about control. About the specific and calculated kind of terror that comes not from something supernatural, but from someone deeply human. Someone who has spent years learning exactly how to make another person doubt themselves. The story centers on Cecilia Cass, a woman who has been living under the domination of Adrian Griffin, a man who is wealthy, brilliant, and dangerous in the particular way that makes him almost impossible to escape from cleanly. Adrian does not just control Cecilia physically. He controls her perception of herself, her sense of what is real, her ability to trust her own instincts. And when she finally escapes him in the film's opening sequence, slipping out of his cliffside fortress in the dead of night with nothing but a bag and shaking hands, there is no feeling of triumph in it. There is only the terrified relief of someone who knows the danger is not over, only temporarily behind her. When word arrives that Adrian has died by suicide, the people around Cecilia expect her to feel free. What she feels instead is something she cannot fully name, a sense that the walls have not gone down, just gone quiet. And then things start to move. What Whannell understood when he built this story is that the most effective horror is not about what you show, it is about what you make the audience feel alongside the character. And the specific feeling he was after here is one that a significant number of people know from real life, even if they have never faced an invisible man. It is the feeling of knowing your reality and watching the people around you fail to confirm it. It is the experience of being told, gently or not so gently, that what you are perceiving is not what is actually happening. Gaslight as a word gets used loosely these days, but what this film depicts is the genuine psychological mechanism of it, the slow erosion of a person's confidence in their own senses, carried out by someone who understands exactly which pressure points to apply. By grounding the supernatural threat in that very real emotional experience, Whannell does something unusual for a studio horror film. He makes you afraid not just for Cecilia's physical safety, but for her mind. And that second layer of fear is the one that stays with you after the credits roll. The opening sequence of this film is 10 minutes of almost pure silence, and it is doing more narrative and psychological work than most films accomplish in their entire first act. Cecilia moves through Adrian's modernist cliffside home like someone navigating a space that has been specifically engineered against her, Every step reduced to its absolute minimum, every breath controlled, every movement carrying the weight of someone who has rehearsed this escape so many times in her head that the rehearsal has become its own kind of trauma. Cinematographer Stefan Duccio shoots these early scenes in wide, cold, clinical frames that make the house feel less like a home and more like an institution. Glass walls that offer visibility but no warmth. Hard concrete surfaces. Open-plan rooms that give the illusion of space while the architecture quietly enforces confinement. There is no softness anywhere in this environment, and the camera captures that without ever stating it as a thesis. But the most important choice Whannell and Duccio make in these opening minutes, the choice that shapes how every subsequent scene in the film will function, is where the camera chooses to look when Cecilia is not the subject. It drifts. It lingers on empty doorways. It holds on corners of rooms where nothing is happening. It treats absence the way most cinematography treats presence, as something worth watching, something potentially meaningful. In doing so, it rewires the viewer's visual instincts before the film has even introduced its central threat. By the time Cecilia makes it through that gate, your eyes are already scanning empty spaces the way hers are. You have been trained. And the film is only getting started. In the next part, we are going into what happens once Cecilia reaches what feels like safety, and why that safety is the most carefully constructed trap in the entire film. There is something deeply intentional about the way the Invisible Man handles the transition from Adrian's house to the outside world. Most thriller films would use that shift as a release valve, a moment where the audience finally exhales, where the color palette warms up, where the music softens and signals that the immediate danger has passed. Whannell does not give you that. When Cecilia arrives at the home of her friend James and his teenage daughter Sydney, the relief is present, but it is thin, like a coat that is one size too small for the cold outside. The house is warmer, yes. There are people who care about her, yes. But the camera never fully settles. It never gives you the wide, comfortable establishing shots that signal genuine security. Instead, it keeps doing what it trained you to expect in that opening sequence. It keeps finding the edges of rooms, the spaces behind doorways, the parts of the frame where someone could be standing if they did not want to be seen. The film refuses to let its audience relax, and in doing so it refuses to let Cecilia relax either. What looks like a safe house is, from the very first frame, already coded as a temporary condition. This is the section of the film where Whannell begins building the second layer of Cecilia's ordeal, and in some ways this layer is more psychologically complex than anything the invisible threat itself produces. Because Cecilia is not just recovering from what Adrian did to her inside that relationship. She is recovering from what he did to her sense of self. She is relearning how to exist in a space without constant threat assessment. She is trying to rebuild trust in her own perceptions after years of having those perceptions systematically undermined. Elisabeth Moss plays this phase of Cecilia's arc with a specificity that is genuinely remarkable to watch. She does not play Cecilia as broken. She plays her as someone who is holding herself together with enormous and visible effort, someone whose default state has become hypervigilance, and who is now trying to perform normalcy on top of that hypervigilance without letting the seams show. Watch the way Moss carries her body in these early scenes at James's house. The shoulders never fully drop. The eyes keep moving. She sits at a table with people who love her and she cannot stop tracking the room. That physical performance is doing narrative work that no amount of dialogue could accomplish as efficiently. It tells you everything about who Cecilia was before we ever met her, and everything about what Adrian took from her. The arrival of the news about Adrian's death is one of the film's most carefully constructed emotional beats, and it is worth slowing down on because the film handles it in a way that is far more sophisticated than a standard thriller would bother with. Cecilia does not cry. She does not collapse with grief, and she does not collapse with relief either. She goes very still, and Moss holds that stillness for just long enough that you start reading into it, projecting onto it, trying to figure out what is happening underneath the surface. And then her sister reads the letter from Adrian's brother Tom, explaining the circumstances, and something shifts in Cecilia's face that is not quite relief and not quite suspicion but some uneasy combination of the two. The film is smart enough to let that ambiguity breathe rather than resolving it immediately. Because what Cecilia knows, what her body knows even if she cannot articulate it yet, is that Adrian was not the kind of man who simply decided to stop. He was the kind of man who decided what happened next. And the idea that he simply removed himself from the equation, on his own terms, without any final move against her, that does not fit the architecture of who he was. She has lived inside his psychology long enough to know that. And the film trusts the audience to read that knowledge in her face without underlining it. Then the strange things begin. And this is where the film's technical and directorial achievement becomes almost impossible to overstate, because what Whannell is attempting in this section is genuinely difficult to pull off. He needs you to feel a presence in scenes where there is definitively nothing on screen. He needs the empty space in the frame to generate the same kind of tension that a visible monster would generate, without the visual confirmation that makes fear easy. The tools he uses are precise and deliberate. Sound designer Robert Mackenzie and composer Benjamin Wallfish build a score and a soundscape that operates just below the threshold of obvious. There are low, almost subsonic frequencies running under scenes that appear entirely quiet on the surface, tones that you feel more than hear, that register in your chest before your ears process them. The sound mix is engineered to make silence feel loaded. And then there is the camera work, those slow, unmotivated drifts toward empty corners of rooms that began in the opening sequence and now carry a completely different weight. In the opening, they were establishing a visual language. Here, they are delivering on the promise of that language. When the camera drifts away from Cecilia and holds on an empty hallway, you are no longer watching out of trained instinct. You are watching because you genuinely believe something might be there. And that belief, manufactured entirely through craft, with nothing actually on screen to justify it, is the film's single greatest technical achievement. Because once Cecilia starts acting on that belief, and the people around her start pulling away, what this film becomes is something far darker than a horror story about an invisible man. It becomes a horror story about what happens when the world decides a woman's fear is just a symptom of her instability. There is a particular kind of loneliness that this film understands better than almost any horror movie made in recent memory. It is not the loneliness of being physically isolated, locked in a room, cut off from the world. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who care about you, people who are present, who are trying, who genuinely want to help, and still feeling completely unreachable. Because the thing you are experiencing cannot be verified, cannot be pointed to, cannot be demonstrated in a way that satisfies the reasonable skepticism of someone who has not felt it themselves. That is the specific emotional territory the invisible man moves into in this section of the story, and it is where the film transitions from being a technically impressive horror exercise into something that lands with real psychological weight. Cecilia is not alone. She is just completely, devastatingly unbelieved. And Whannell understands that for a survivor of abuse, those two experiences, being alone and being unbelieved, are functionally identical. The incidents begin small, which is exactly how they need to begin for the film's mechanics to work. A cup moved from where she left it. A noise in a room she knows was empty. The feeling of a presence at the edge of her peripheral vision that disappears the moment she turns to look. These are the kinds of things that, in isolation, carry no weight at all. Everyone misplaces things. Everyone hears sounds in a quiet house. Everyone occasionally gets the sensation that they are not alone in a room. The film is banking on the fact that you know this, that you are applying the same reasonable framework to Cecilia's early experiences that the people around her are applying. And it is doing that deliberately, because it needs you to feel the gap between what Cecilia knows and what can be proven. Elisabeth Moss plays these early disturbance scenes with a restraint that is crucial to the film's credibility. She does not immediately spiral. She does not start making dramatic accusations. She checks. She double-checks. She applies her own skepticism to her own perceptions before she brings them to anyone else. And that measured, careful response is important, because it tells you that Cecilia is not someone who jumps to conclusions. When she eventually becomes certain, that certainty has been earned through a process of elimination that the audience has witnessed in real time. James is the film's most carefully written supporting character, and his arc in this section of the story deserves attention because it is doing something more nuanced than a simple skeptic role. He is not dismissive of Cecilia out of cruelty or carelessness. He is dismissive out of a very specific kind of protective love, the kind that wants so badly for someone to be okay that it unconsciously resists evidence that they are not. When Cecilia begins expressing her fears about Adrian, James hears them through the filter of what he knows, that Adrian is dead, that Cecilia has been through severe trauma, that the mind under that kind of sustained stress does not always produce reliable perceptions. His skepticism is rational. It is even compassionate in its intention. And that is precisely what makes it so damaging. Because Cecilia does not need rationality right now. She needs someone to sit with her in the uncertainty rather than explain it away. And James, despite everything he genuinely feels for her, cannot quite get there. He keeps trying to solve her fear rather than validate it. And every time he does, the distance between them grows in a way that neither of them fully registers until it is too late. That dynamic, the well-meaning person whose rational framework becomes its own form of harm, is one of the most honest things this film puts on screen. The scene where Cecilia discovers the attic camera equipment is the moment the film shifts from psychological unease into something with harder edges. Up until this point, the threat has been atmospheric, felt rather than confirmed, experienced rather than evidenced. The camera in the attic changes that. It is physical. It is real. It is something she can hold in her hands and point to. And for one brief, charged moment, the film gives Cecilia, and the audience, the sensation of solid ground. She has proof. Not of the invisible suit, not of Adrian's survival, but of surveillance. Of deliberate, calculated watching. Of someone who was present in this space in a way that was hidden and intentional. The weight of that discovery on Moss's face is extraordinary. It is not triumph, it is not relief, it is the grim and exhausted recognition of someone who already knew the shape of this and is now simply holding the confirmation of it. But the film does not let that solid ground hold for long. Because what Cecilia discovers almost immediately is that having evidence and being believed are not the same thing, and that a man as meticulous as Adrian would never leave a piece of evidence behind that he had not already prepared an explanation for. The camera belonged to the house's previous owner. There is documentation. There is a trail. And just like that, the solid ground dissolves back into doubt, not Cecilia's doubt, but everyone else's. And what this film is really about, underneath all the genre mechanics, snaps into focus with a clarity that is almost suffocating. Cecilia is not fighting an invisible man. She is fighting a system of perception, of credibility, of who gets to define what is real, that was built to work against her long before Adrian ever put on that suit. Adrian Griffin is never the most frightening thing in this film because of what he can do physically. The invisible suit is a remarkable piece of technology within the world of the story, and the sequences built around it are genuinely masterful. But the suit is not the source of the deepest dread this film produces. The deepest dread comes from something far more familiar and far more calculated. It comes from watching a man who has spent years studying one specific person. Her patterns, her fears, her relationships, the precise architecture of her credibility with the people around her, deploy that knowledge like a surgeon. Adrian does not just want to frighten Cecilia. He wants to dismantle her. He wants to take the life she is trying to build without him and quietly, methodically reduce it to rubble, one carefully placed incident at a time. And what makes that ambition so chilling is how little effort it appears to require. He does not need to do very much at all. He just needs to know her well enough to know exactly where to apply pressure. And after years inside that relationship, he knows her better than she knows herself. The escalation in this section of the film is structured with a patience that is unusual for the genre. Whannell is not in a hurry to stack incident upon incident in a way that overwhelms the audience or breaks the film's internal logic. Instead, he builds the pressure the way water builds behind a dam, slowly, continuously, invisibly, until the weight of it becomes undeniable. The incidents that Cecilia experiences in this stretch of the story are individually deniable. A sketch she drew appearing in Sydney's school portfolio. An email sent from her account that she did not write. Small violations, each one designed to sit right at the edge of what could plausibly be explained away. And that is exactly the point. Each individual incident is survivable as an accusation of carelessness or instability. It is only the pattern that reveals the intelligence behind it. But patterns require belief, and belief requires trust, and trust is precisely what Adrian has been eroding since the moment Cecilia left him. He is not creating chaos. He is creating a very specific and very deliberate narrative about who Cecilia is, a narrative in which she is unstable, unreliable, and unraveling, and he is seeding it into the people around her one small incident at a time, knowing that by the time she tries to push back against it, the story will already be written. What Moss does with Cecilia's mental and emotional state across this stretch of the film is one of the great sustained physical performances in recent American cinema. And it does not get nearly enough recognition in that context because the genre framing tends to pull critical attention toward the technical craft rather than the acting. But watch what she is managing simultaneously in these scenes. She is playing a woman who is becoming increasingly certain of a reality that she cannot prove, while simultaneously monitoring how that certainty is being received by the people around her, while simultaneously trying to perform a version of stability that keeps those relationships intact, while simultaneously fighting the creeping internal question that any person in her position would eventually face. The question of whether the people who doubt her might have a point. That last layer is the most devastating one, and Moss never lets you forget it is there. There is a specific kind of exhaustion in her eyes during this section that is not just the exhaustion of fear or stress, it is the exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously, the external one against Adrian and the internal one against her own eroding confidence in her perception of reality. That dual combat is what abuse at its most sophisticated actually looks like, and the film captures it with an honesty that very few mainstream horror productions would have the patience or the courage to pursue. The scene where Cecilia is sedated and taken to the psychiatric facility is the film's first true point of no return, and Whannell shoots it in a way that strips away every remaining layer of ambiguity about the stakes of what Cecilia is facing. Up until this point the threat, while real and escalating, has existed in a space where the audience could still theoretically construct an alternative explanation if they chose to. The sedation scene closes that space entirely. This is not a misunderstanding that can be walked back with a conversation. This is not a moment of concern that a good night's sleep and some reassurance will resolve. Cecilia is now inside a system, medical, legal, institutional, that has formally decided her perception of reality is a symptom to be managed rather than an experience to be taken seriously. And Adrian, invisible and undetected, has maneuvered her into that system without leaving a single fingerprint on the process. The facility is clean and quiet and staffed by people who mean well. It is also a cage. And what is most disturbing about the way this sequence is filmed is that the cage looks, from the outside, entirely reasonable. There is nothing visibly wrong with the care being provided. There is nothing overtly sinister about the people making decisions about Cecilia's life. The horror here is systemic rather than individual, which makes it both more realistic and more difficult to confront, because there is no single villain in this room to point at, just a collection of well-intentioned people operating within a framework that was never designed to account for what Cecilia is actually experiencing. And somewhere outside that building, unseen and unchallenged, Adrian Griffin is watching all of it land exactly as he planned. There is a specific moment in this film where the audience crosses a threshold that most horror movies never actually reach. A point where the fear stops being about what might happen and becomes entirely about what is already happening and cannot be stopped. That threshold is not a single scene. It is a cumulative weight that builds across everything we have watched Cecilia endure up to this point, the dismissed incidents, the eroded relationships, the institutional confinement, and it arrives quietly, without announcement, somewhere in the middle of this stretch of the story. You realize, almost without meaning to, that Cecilia is not in danger of losing control of her life. She has already lost it. The ground was taken from beneath her so gradually, so methodically, so invisibly, that neither she nor the audience fully registered the moment it happened. And that realization, that the loss was not coming but is already complete, is far more destabilizing than any jump scare this film could have deployed. Because jump scares end. They spike and resolve. What Cecilia is living through does not resolve. It compounds. Each day inside the facility, each unanswered question, each well-meaning dismissal from someone who is supposed to be helping her, adds another layer to a situation that is becoming structurally impossible to escape from through any conventional means. Whannell understood something essential about sustained psychological horror, that the most effective version of it is not the kind that frightens you in a moment but the kind that makes the entire world feel like it has been quietly reorganized against you while you were not looking. And by this point in the film, that reorganization is complete. The facility sequences are deliberately paced in a way that some viewers have found slow, but that slowness is doing precise and necessary work. Whannell is not padding the runtime here. He is making you feel the texture of confinement, the way time moves differently when your autonomy has been removed, the way even comfortable spaces become oppressive when you are in them without choice. The production design in these scenes is worth examining closely because it operates on a principle of deliberate ambiguity. The facility is not a dungeon. It is not visually coded as a threatening environment in the way that genre conventions would typically signal danger. The lighting is soft. The spaces are clean. The staff are calm and professional and treat Cecilia with what looks, on the surface, like genuine care. And that visual neutrality is the most psychologically sophisticated choice the film makes in this entire section, because it removes the audience's ability to point at something obviously wrong. There is no obvious wrong here. There is just a woman who knows something that the environment around her has been structured to make impossible to prove, surrounded by people whose entire professional framework orients them toward explaining her certainty as a symptom rather than engaging with it as a report. The horror in these scenes is architectural. It is baked into the logic of the situation rather than expressed through any single threatening element. And that architectural horror, the horror of being trapped inside a system that looks reasonable from every external angle, is one of the most honest and unsettling things this film puts on screen. It is during this period of confinement that the film begins developing one of its most important and most underappreciated thematic threads. The question of what it actually costs a person to be right when being right offers no practical relief. Cecilia knows Adrian is alive. She knows he is wearing the suit. She knows he orchestrated every incident that led to her being in this facility, and she knows that from inside these walls she has absolutely no mechanism for proving any of it. And here is what Moss communicates in these scenes that a lesser performance would have missed entirely. Cecilia is not comforted by her own certainty. Being right, in her situation, is not a source of strength or clarity. It is just another form of isolation. Because the gap between what she knows and what she can demonstrate to anyone else is not narrowing, it is widening with every day that passes, with every conversation that goes nowhere, with every moment that Adrian remains invisible and she remains the only person in any room who understands the actual shape of what is happening. That gap, between private knowledge and public credibility, is something that enormous numbers of people who have experienced sustained abuse understand at a cellular level. And the film honors that understanding by refusing to soften it or resolve it prematurely. It sits in that gap with Cecilia, without flinching, and makes the audience sit in it too. What finally shifts the momentum of this section is not a dramatic revelation or a sudden piece of undeniable evidence. It is something smaller and more human than that. It is a conversation with her sister Emily that cracks open just enough doubt in someone close to Cecilia to create the first hairline fracture in the wall of disbelief that has been constructed around her. Emily does not fully believe her. But she begins, tentatively and almost reluctantly, to consider the possibility that Cecilia's certainty is not simply a product of trauma and stress, that there might be something underneath it worth examining. That shift is tiny. In the context of everything Cecilia is up against, it is almost nothing. But Whannell frames it with a quiet significance that tells you it matters, that this small crack in the surface of disbelief is the first millimeter of daylight in a situation that has been completely sealed. And daylight, in this story, does not mean safety. It does not mean the nightmare is ending. It means Cecilia now has just enough room to move, and what she chooses to do with that room is about to change the entire direction of this film in ways that nobody around her, including the audience, is fully prepared for.
For most of this film, Cecilia has been entirely reactive. Every decision she has made, every action she has taken, has been a response to something Adrian initiated, an escape from his house, a retreat into someone else's space, an attempt to manage the fallout of incidents she did not cause and could not prevent. She has been operating entirely within a framework that he designed, responding to moves on a board whose layout he controls, and the cumulative effect of that dynamic on her psychology has been visible in every scene Moss has played up to this point. The tight shoulders, the scanning eyes, the exhausted vigilance of someone who has stopped believing that stillness is ever truly safe. But something changes in this section of the film. It is not a dramatic transformation. It does not arrive with swelling music or a montage of Cecilia finding her inner strength in the way that lesser films would choreograph a turning point. It is quieter and more complicated than that. A shift that happens at the level of decision-making rather than emotion. A moment where Cecilia stops waiting for the situation to resolve itself and starts actively trying to change its shape. She does not have a plan yet. She does not have evidence or allies or any of the structural advantages that Adrian has spent weeks systematically stripping away from her. What she has is the knowledge that staying entirely passive is no longer a survivable option. That if she keeps reacting, keeps absorbing, keeps trying to manage a situation that was designed to be unmanageable, she will be completely consumed by it before anyone outside her own head understands what actually happened to her. And that knowledge, as fragile and insufficient as it is the first genuine agency Cecilia has exercised since the opening minutes of this film. It is a small thing, but in the context of everything this story has done to her, it feels enormous. It feels, for the first time, like the beginning of a counterattack. The sequence where Cecilia begins actively testing the boundaries of what she can verify about Adrian's presence is one of the most technically precise in the entire film, and it rewards close attention because it is operating on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is a series of small experiments, objects placed deliberately, rooms entered in specific ways, behaviors designed to provoke a reaction from something she cannot see. But underneath the surface mechanics, what Whannell is really doing in these scenes is something far more interesting. He is showing you the mind of a person who was trained by years of living with a controlling and manipulative partner to read invisible signals, to detect mood shifts and threat levels from the subtlest environmental cues, and is now applying that same trained perceptiveness as an investigative tool. The skills that Adrian spent years exploiting, Cecilia's heightened sensitivity to her environment, her ability to detect changes in atmosphere that other people would miss entirely, are being redirected. The very hypervigilance that abuse produced in her is now the instrument she is using to build a case against the person who produced it. That irony is not accidental. Whannell is making a specific and pointed argument here about the relationship between trauma and survival, about how the adaptations that people develop inside abusive situations are not simply damage, but are also, in the right circumstances, a form of intelligence. Cecilia knows how to read a room in ways that most people never learned because most people never needed to. And right now, that knowledge is the only real advantage she has. The film does not make this argument loudly. It does not pause to underline it or have a character articulate it in dialogue. It just shows you Cecilia working and trusts you to understand what you are watching. Benjamin Wallfish's scar during this section of the film deserves specific attention because it is doing something unusual and genuinely effective that tends to get absorbed into the overall viewing experience without receiving the conscious recognition it has earned. In most horror films, the score operates as a kind of emotional cue system. It tells you when to be afraid, when to relax, when something significant is about to happen. Wallfish largely refuses that function here. The music in these scenes is deliberately withholding. It gives you tension without resolution, builds without releasing, creates a sustained low-level unease that never spikes into the kind of dramatic swell that would tell your nervous system how to process what you are watching. And the effect of that withholding is profound, because it means your body never gets the release that a conventional score would provide. The tension just accumulates, scene by scene, with no musical permission to exhale. Combined with the sound design, those subsonic frequencies running beneath the apparent quiet of scenes that look entirely still, the overall auditory experience of this section of the film is one of the most sophisticated uses of sound as a psychological instrument in recent mainstream horror. You are not just watching Cecilia exist in a state of sustained threat. You are being made to feel that state from the inside, through frequencies and musical choices that operate below the level of conscious awareness. That is craft of a very high order, and it is one of the primary reasons why this film works on audiences who might intellectually resist its premise, because the sound alone is enough to keep your nervous system convinced, regardless of what your rational mind is doing with the story. The moment where Cecilia finally forces a visible physical reaction from the invisible presence, the first moment in the film where the threat is confirmed not through feeling or suspicion but through an actual observable event, is staged with a restraint that most directors would have been unable to resist upgrading into something more spectacular. Whannell keeps it small, a disturbance in the air, a movement that should not be possible. Something that lasts perhaps 2 seconds on screen and is gone before Cecilia can fully process it. But those 2 seconds carry the weight of everything that has come before them, every dismissed incident, every unanswered question, every moment of isolation and disbelief. And Moss plays the aftermath with a devastatingly specific mixture of vindication and fresh terror. Because being right does not make her safe. It just confirms that the danger she has been living with is real, present, and still completely invisible to everyone around her. And what this film understands, with a clarity that cuts through all the genre mechanics, is that confirmation without protection is not relief. It is just a more informed version of the same fear. The situation has not improved. It has simply become undeniable. And undeniable, in Cecilia's world, is a very long way from being believed. There is a particular kind of intelligence that this film attributes to Adrian Griffin that separates him from the conventional horror antagonist in ways that are worth examining carefully, because the distinction matters enormously to how the film functions as a psychological experience. Most horror villains operate through overwhelming force. They are stronger, faster, more physically capable than their victims. And the terror they produce is essentially the terror of being outmatched in a direct confrontation. Adrian is not that kind of threat. He is not primarily a physical danger, although the film will demonstrate that he is capable of genuine violence when it serves his purposes. What makes him dangerous at a fundamental level is that he is a strategist. He thinks in systems. He understands that the most durable form of control is not the kind you impose through force, but the kind you engineer through information, through knowing your target so completely, understanding their relationships and their vulnerabilities and their credibility with the people around them so thoroughly that you can manipulate outcomes from a distance without ever needing to be visible. That kind of intelligence requires patience. It requires the willingness to play a long game, to accept short-term invisibility in exchange for long-term dominance. And it requires, above everything else, an intimate and detailed knowledge of the specific person you are targeting. Adrian has all of those things in relation to Cecilia. He has years of accumulated data about exactly who she is, how she thinks, how she reacts, what she values, who she trusts, what she is most afraid of losing. And in this section of the film, he begins deploying that data with a precision that is genuinely terrifying to watch unfold, because every move he makes is so perfectly calibrated to its target that it feels less like improvised cruelty and more like the execution of a plan that was drafted long before Cecilia ever walked out of his house. The suit gave him invisibility, but the years he spent with her gave him the map. And the map, it turns out, is the more dangerous weapon. The relationship between Cecilia and Sydney, James's teenage daughter, has been one of the film's quieter emotional investments up to this point, and it is worth pausing to recognize what that relationship has been doing in the background of the story before examining what Adrian chooses to do with it. Sydney is not a deeply developed character in the conventional sense. The film does not give her a fully rendered interior life or a substantial arc of her own. But she functions in the story as something specific and important. She is the person in Cecilia's immediate environment who is most open to her, most willing to receive her without the protective skepticism that the adults around her have defaulted to. James loves Cecilia but cannot fully follow her into the territory of what she is claiming. Emily is beginning to crack but is still operating primarily from a position of concerned doubt. Sydney, by contrast, simply accepts Cecilia's experience without requiring it to be explained or justified. She is young enough that her framework for what is possible has not yet fully calcified into the rational shape that adulthood tends to impose. And Adrian understands exactly what that relationship means to Cecilia, understands that it is one of the few sources of genuine warmth and uncomplicated acceptance that she has left, which is precisely why he targets it. The email sent from Cecilia's account to Sydney, the one designed to devastate the relationship between them with a single calculated cruelty, is not an act of random malice. It is a surgical strike against the last remaining space where Cecilia feels safe. And the fact that it works, that it lands exactly as intended and produces exactly the damage it was designed to produce, is one of the coldest and most upsetting moments in the entire film. Not because of what it shows, but because of what it confirms about the level of deliberation behind it. James's reaction to the email incident is where the film makes one of its most painful and most honest dramatic choices, and it deserves careful attention because it would have been very easy for Whannell to write this moment as a simple betrayal, to make James the obstacle, the unbeliever, the person whose failure of faith in Cecilia marks him as complicit in her suffering. But the film is smarter and more compassionate than that. James does not turn on Cecilia because he has stopped caring about her. He turns because he has a daughter, and his daughter has been hurt, and the evidence in front of him points in a direction that his love for Cecilia is not sufficient to override. His reaction is not the reaction of someone who never believed her. It is the reaction of someone who wanted to believe her and has now been presented with something that makes that belief feel dangerous to maintain. And Moss plays the scene where she processes his withdrawal with a devastating restraint. There is no explosion, no breakdown, no dramatic confrontation. There is just the quiet, terrible recognition of someone watching the last door close. The loss of James is not just the loss of a place to stay or a person who was protecting her. It is the loss of the final external anchor that was keeping Cecilia connected to a version of reality that other people could share with her. Without it, she is completely alone inside her own knowledge of what is true. And Adrian, invisible and undetected, has engineered that aloneness with the patience and the precision of someone who knew exactly how long it would take and exactly which pieces needed to fall in exactly which order to produce it. The film's decision to bring Cecilia's sister Emily back into the story at this precise moment is a structural choice that reveals a great deal about how carefully Whannell has mapped the emotional architecture of this narrative. Emily's reappearance is not accidental timing. It is the story recognizing that Cecilia cannot be pushed any further into isolation without losing the audience's ability to follow her into the next phase of the story. There needs to be one thread left. One connection that has not yet been fully severed. And Emily, who has been hovering at the edges of disbelief without fully committing to it, who has been carrying her own guilt about the years Cecilia spent inside that relationship, represents the most credible candidate for that final thread. Their dinner together is one of the most tensely constructed sequences in the film, not because of anything supernatural that happens during it, but because of what it requires from both characters. Cecilia has to perform normalcy convincingly enough to get through the meal, has to manage her own fear and exhaustion and grief sufficiently to be present for a conversation with someone she desperately needs to reach. And Emily has to navigate her own complicated mixture of guilt and doubt and love in real time, in a public space, with years of unsaid things pressing against the surface of every exchange. Whannell and his cast hold all of that tension across the entire sequence without releasing it, and then Adrian releases it for them, in the most brutal and irreversible way the film has yet produced. What happens in that restaurant does not just change the direction of the story. It eliminates an entire category of possible futures for Cecilia in a single moment, and does it in a way that is designed, with Adrian's characteristic precision, to make her the only person in the room who will ever know the truth of what actually occurred. What happens in that restaurant is the film's single most violent narrative rupture, the moment where the story stops being about psychological torment and becomes something with immediate, irreversible, physical consequences. And the way Whannell stages it is a masterclass in using the audience's own trained expectations against them. By this point in the film, you have been conditioned to scan empty space. You have been watching backgrounds, tracking the edges of frames, reading the negative space around characters the way the film taught you to in its opening minutes. You are, in other words, a more alert and more paranoid viewer than you were when this film started. And Whannell uses that heightened alertness with surgical precision in the restaurant sequence. He gives you a crowded, busy, visually complex environment full of movement and noise and people, exactly the kind of space where an invisible presence would be most difficult to detect and most dangerous to confront. And then he puts Cecilia and Emily in the middle of it and makes you watch every frame with the desperate attention of someone who knows something terrible is about to happen but cannot locate where the threat is coming from. The staging is impeccable. The camera stays close enough to create claustrophobia without losing the sense of the wider space around the two women. The ambient noise of the restaurant, conversations, cutlery, music, is mixed in a way that fills every moment of silence between Cecilia and Emily with the suggestion of something moving just beyond the frame. And then it happens. Swift, horrifying, and staged in a way that makes Cecilia look, to every witness in that room, like the only possible explanation. Emily collapses. And Cecilia is standing there with the weapon in her hand, with no memory of picking it up, surrounded by a room full of people who saw exactly what Adrian needed them to see. The trap has not just snapped shut. It has been welded closed from the outside, in public, with witnesses, in a way that strips away every remaining avenue of defense that Cecilia had left. This is not a setback. This is an annihilation. And the expression on Moss's face in the immediate aftermath, that fractured, uncomprehending horror of someone trying to process an event that their own mind cannot fully accept, is one of the most extraordinary single moments of screen acting in this entire film. The arrest and its immediate aftermath strip the film down to its barest and most uncomfortable emotional register, and it is worth staying in that discomfort for a moment rather than moving past it too quickly, because what Whannell is doing here is completing a process that has been running since the opening sequence. Cecilia began this film as a woman escaping. She is now a woman who has been completely recaptured, not by Adrian directly, not by the invisible suit or the physical threat he represents, but by the institutional and legal machinery of a world that has been fed a very specific and very carefully constructed version of who she is and what she is capable of. She is in handcuffs. She is being processed by a system that has no framework for what actually happened in that restaurant, that can only work with the evidence it can see, and the evidence it can see tells a story that Adrian wrote. And the particular cruelty of her situation in these scenes is that she understands, with complete clarity, exactly how this happened and exactly who is responsible, and that understanding is worth precisely nothing in the context of where she now finds herself. Knowledge without proof is not a defense. Certainty without corroboration is not an alibi. And Adrian, who has spent this entire film engineering situations in which Cecilia's knowledge and certainty are her only assets, has now placed her in a situation where those assets are not just insufficient, they are actively working against her, because the more certain she sounds about an invisible man in a high-tech suit, the more easily the people processing her case can file that certainty under the heading of instability and move on. She is more trapped now than she was in his house. And the house, at least, she knew how to escape from. The film's handling of the Adrian reveal, the confirmation, delivered through Tom, that Adrian has indeed faked his death and that the suit is real and that everything Cecilia has been experiencing has been exactly what she said it was, is staged with a deliberate lack of triumphalism that reveals everything about Whannell's priorities as a storyteller. There is no moment of external validation here that functions as relief. Tom's confirmation does not free Cecilia. It does not undo what happened to Emily. It does not erase the arrest or the weeks of institutional dismissal or the relationships that have been destroyed. It just makes the truth officially visible to one more person, a person who is himself compromised, who has his own reasons for coming forward and his own stake in how this story gets told. And Cecilia receives that confirmation not with the vindicated relief of someone who has finally been believed, but with the cold, focused attention of someone who has moved past needing to be believed and is now thinking entirely about what comes next. That shift, from the need for validation to the pure mechanics of survival, is the most significant internal transition Cecilia undergoes in this entire film, and Moss communicates it without a single line of dialogue, entirely through the quality of her stillness and the specific way her eyes change when Tom finishes speaking. It is the moment the prey decides to become the predator. And the film, from this point forward, belongs entirely to that decision. What the deal with Adrian represents, the offer to walk free in exchange for returning to him, filtered through Tom as an intermediary, is the film's most explicit and most revolting articulation of the dynamic that has been running beneath the surface of this entire story. Adrian does not want to destroy Cecilia. He wants to own her. Destruction would be a conclusion, and conclusions are not what controlling people want from the people they control. What they want is continuation, ongoing access, ongoing dominance, ongoing proof that the other person cannot exist outside the terms that the controlling partner has set. The offer is framed, through Tom, in language that is almost reasonable, a way out, a resolution, an end to the legal situation that is consuming her life. But what it actually is, stripped of that framing, is a demand for surrender. A requirement that Cecilia acknowledge, through her actions if not her words, that Adrian's version of their relationship is the correct one, that she belongs in his orbit, on his terms. and that the attempt to leave was always going to end hey. And the fact that she is sitting in a detention facility, facing serious criminal charges, with her sister in a hospital and her closest friend's family destroyed, makes the offer feel, for one deeply uncomfortable moment, like something she might have to consider. That discomfort, the audience's fleeting, guilty recognition that the trap has been built well enough that the wrong choice is starting to look like a reasonable one, is the most sophisticated emotional manipulation the film has yet attempted. And it is completely intentional. There is a moment that arrives in every great survival story where the character at the center of it stops being defined by what is being done to them and starts being defined by what they choose to do about it. That moment has been building in The Invisible Man across 8 chapters of sustained psychological dismantling, across escape attempts and dismissals and institutional confinement, and the methodical destruction of every relationship and every safety net that Cecilia had managed to construct in the aftermath of leaving Adrian. And when it finally arrives, it does not look the way that moment typically looks in films of this kind. There is no speech. There is no single galvanizing scene where the music swells and the camera holds on Cecilia's face while she finds her resolve in a way that the audience can applaud. What there is instead is something quieter and more disturbing and ultimately more true, a decision made in stillness, with full knowledge of its cost, by a woman who has run out of every option except the one she has been avoiding because of what it will require her to become. Cecilia accepts Adrian's offer. She agrees to go back. And in the moment she makes that agreement, you can see in Moss's performance that this is not defeat and it is not surrender and it is not the film losing faith in its own protagonist. It is strategy. It is the decision of someone who has finally understood that the only way to fight an invisible enemy on terrain they control is to stop trying to fight from a position of weakness and start engineering a position of strength, even if engineering that position requires walking back into the exact space she spent the opening minutes of this film risking everything to escape from. The reversal is not a regression. It is the most aggressive move Cecilia has made in the entire film. And the fact that it looks on the surface like capitulation is precisely what makes it so dangerous, and precisely what Adrian, for all his meticulous intelligence, does not fully account for. He has been so focused on breaking her that he has not left sufficient room in his calculations for the possibility that she might break deliberately as a tactic, with a plan already forming behind the stillness of her eyes. The preparation sequence, the period between Cecilia's agreement and her actual return to Adrian's space, is handled with a brevity that initially feels like it might be a missed opportunity but reveals itself, on reflection, to be exactly the right choice. Whannell does not linger here. He does not give Cecilia a montage of preparation, does not show her acquiring tools or forming alliances or building the kind of elaborate counter-strategy that a conventional thriller would spend 20 minutes constructing. What he gives you instead is a series of small, quiet moments, looks, decisions, the particular way Cecilia moves through spaces that she is now assessing with different eyes, that communicate the shift in her internal state without spelling it out. And that restraint is important, because spelling it out would break the tension the film has been building across its entire runtime. The audience does not need to know exactly what Cecilia is planning. The audience needs to feel that she is planning, needs to sense the change in the quality of her attention, the new purposefulness underneath the performed compliance, the way she is now reading every environment she moves through not as a potential threat but as a potential resource. Moss carries all of that in her body without a single expository line of dialogue to support her, and it is a reminder of how much this entire film has depended on her ability to communicate interior states through purely physical means. The camera has given her very little help in these moments. No close-ups designed to invite the audience into her psychology, no musical cues signaling that something important is shifting. Just Moss, in medium shot, doing the work of making you understand everything that is happening inside a character who has learned, through years of living with someone who watched her constantly, how to keep everything important completely invisible. The irony of that, Cecilia learning the art of invisibility from the man who weaponized it against her, is one of the film's richest and most quietly devastating threads. The return to Adrian's house lands with a weight that is almost physical, a full-circle narrative moment that Whannell shoots in a way that deliberately echoes the opening sequence while inverting every element of its emotional logic. Where the opening had Cecilia moving through the house in pure reactive fear, desperate to leave without being detected. The return has her moving through the same spaces with a controlled intentionality that reads, on the surface, as compliance but underneath carries something completely different. The house has not changed. The glass walls are still there, the hard surfaces, the open spaces designed to make concealment impossible. But Cecilia has changed. She is not the same person who fled through that gate in the dark, and the film communicates that difference not through anything she says or any dramatic gesture she makes, but through the simple fact of how she looks at the rooms around her. She is not scanning for threats anymore. She is taking inventory. The shift is subtle enough that it could be missed on a first viewing, but it is completely intentional. Whannell and Moss are showing you, in the way Cecilia's eyes move through the space, that she has stopped being a person trapped inside Adrian's architecture and started being a person who is learning to use that architecture against its designer. The house that was built to control her is about to become the instrument of her counterattack, and the film holds that knowledge in reserve, letting it sit just below the surface of every scene, creating a tension that is completely different in character from the tension that has powered the previous sections of the story. Before, the tension came from not knowing what Adrian would do next. Now it comes from not knowing exactly what Cecilia is going to do, and from the growing certainty that when she does it, it will be something that nobody, including the audience, has fully anticipated. The scene where Cecilia and Adrian occupy the same space together for the first time since the film's opening, where she is present in his environment, under his observation, performing the version of herself that he wants to see, is the film's most complex and most layered piece of dramatic construction, and it demands close attention because almost everything important in it is happening underneath the surface of the dialogue. Adrian is performing too. He is performing reasonableness, performing the controlled warmth of a man who has gotten what he wanted and is now willing to be generous in his victory. And the scene is constructed as a performance within a performance, two people who know each other completely, who understand exactly what the other is doing, both pretending with perfect conviction that the pretense is real. Moss plays Cecilia's compliance with a precision that walks an almost impossibly narrow line. She needs to be convincing enough that Adrian believes the act, while simultaneously communicating to the audience, through the smallest possible signals, that the act is exactly what it is. A glance held a fraction of a second too long. A stillness in the body that looks like calm but has the quality of coiled tension underneath it. A smile that reaches the muscles of the face without quite making it to the eyes. These are microscopic details, and the fact that Moss delivers them with such consistency and control across a scene that requires her to maintain the surface performance simultaneously is a demonstration of technical acting ability that belongs in the same conversation as the finest screen performances of this era. Adrian thinks he has won, and Cecilia needs him to keep thinking that for exactly as long as it takes for her plan to reach the point where his certainty becomes the mechanism of his undoing. There is a specific kind of dramatic irony that the best thrillers deploy in their third act, a situation where the audience knows something that at least one character in the story does not, and that gap in knowledge creates a tension that is almost unbearable to sit inside because you can see the collision coming and you cannot do anything to alter its trajectory. The Invisible Man builds toward exactly that kind of irony in this section of the story, but it executes it with a twist that elevates it above the conventional version of the device, because here, the character who does not know everything they need to know is not the victim. It is the predator. Adrian has spent this entire film operating from a position of informational superiority, from the assumption that he understands Cecilia completely, her psychology, her limitations, her capacity for resistance, and that his plan accounts for every variable she is capable of introducing. That assumption is the foundation of everything he has built. And foundations, in stories like this one, exist to be undermined. The dramatic irony operating in this section of The Invisible Man is not the simple kind where the audience knows the monster is behind the door. It is the more sophisticated kind where the audience is beginning to understand that the monster has made a fundamental miscalculation, that the model of Cecilia he has been operating from is out of date, that it was built from the person she was inside the relationship rather than the person she has become in the process of surviving everything he has put her through. He knows her history. He does not fully know her present. And that gap, small as it might appear from the outside, is the space through which this entire story is about to turn. The discovery of the second suit is the film's most important single plot revelation, and the way it is staged reflects a directorial confidence that is worth examining in some detail, because Whannell makes choices here that a less assured filmmaker would almost certainly have made differently. The temptation, at this moment in the story, would be to play the discovery big, to give it weight through music, through dramatic camera movement, through the kind of visual and auditory emphasis that tells the audience this is the moment everything changes. Whannell does the opposite. The suit is found quietly. The camera does not lurch toward it. The score does not swell. The discovery is presented with almost the same visual register as any other object in any other room, and the effect of that restraint is paradoxically more powerful than any amount of dramatic emphasis would have produced, because it means the weight of the moment has to be carried entirely by what the audience brings to it, by the accumulated tension of everything that has preceded this scene, by the understanding of exactly what this object means in the context of everything Cecilia has been through. The suit does not need the film to tell you it is important. You already know it is important. You have known it since the first time you felt something in an empty room alongside Cecilia, since the first time the camera drifted toward a corner and your body responded before your brain did. The suit is the physical confirmation of a truth the film has been building toward since its opening frame. And its quiet discovery, handled without fanfare, lands with more force than a dozen dramatic reveals would have produced, because the force comes from within the audience rather than from the screen. What Cecilia does with the suit, the decision to wear it, to use it, to take the tool that was designed and deployed as an instrument of her destruction and turn it into the instrument of her counterattack, is the film's defining act of character, and it deserves to be understood in the full context of what it means for who Cecilia is and what this story has been saying about her. There is a reading of this moment that frames it as straightforward empowerment. The victim reclaims the weapon. The balance of power shifts. The third act begins. That reading is not wrong, but it is insufficient, because it misses the specific complexity of what Moss brings to the scene and what Whannell has built into the construction of the choice itself. Cecilia putting on that suit is not a triumphant moment. It is an uncomfortable one, because the suit represents everything that was done to her, the surveillance, the violation, the calculated terror of being watched and touched and manipulated by something she could not see. Wearing it means inhabiting that experience from the inside, means using the logic of Adrian's cruelty as the logic of her own action. And the film does not pretend that this is a clean or uncomplicated thing to do. Moss plays the moment of putting the suit on with a quality that sits somewhere between determination and grief, the look of someone who understands exactly what they are becoming in this moment and has decided that becoming it is necessary, even knowing that necessity does not make it cost nothing. That nuance is what separates this film's handling of the third act from the conventional revenge thriller template. Cecilia is not transformed by the suit into something powerful and free. She is doing something difficult and morally complex for reasons that the story has spent its entire runtime earning the right to make comprehensible. The sequence that follows, Cecilia moving through Adrian's house invisible, operating in the space that was built to contain her but now contains her on completely different terms, is the film's most visually and conceptually rich extended passage, and it rewards attention on multiple levels simultaneously. On the immediate thriller level, it is tense and precise and expertly constructed. The mechanics of what Cecilia is doing and how she is doing it are communicated with clarity and economy, and the staging of the physical action is confident without being showy. But underneath the surface mechanics, what is happening in these scenes is a complete inversion of every visual and spatial dynamic the film has established across its entire runtime. The empty spaces that the camera has been treating as threats throughout this story are now Cecilia's territory. The negative space in the frame that has carried dread since the opening sequence is now the space she occupies and controls. The architecture of surveillance and control that Adrian built this house to embody is now being used against its designer by the person it was designed to trap. Every visual choice in this sequence is a direct callback to an inversion of choices made earlier in the film, and the cumulative effect of those inversions, experienced against the backdrop of everything the audience has been through alongside Cecilia, is one of the most satisfying pieces of sustained visual storytelling that mainstream horror has produced in recent memory. The house has not changed. The suit has not changed. What has changed is who is wearing it and what they intend to do with it. And that change, communicated almost entirely through visual language rather than dialogue or exposition, is the fullest expression of what this film has been building toward from its very first frame. There is a quality to the action in the third act of The Invisible Man that distinguishes it from virtually every other physical confrontation sequence in contemporary Hollywood horror, and that distinction is not primarily about choreography or visual effects or the technical execution of the invisible suit concept, although all of those elements are handled with a craft and a precision that the film has thoroughly earned the right to deploy at this point in the story. The distinction is emotional. Every physical confrontation in this section of the film carries the full psychological weight of everything that has preceded it, every dismissed incident, every destroyed relationship, every moment of institutional confinement and calculated isolation, and that accumulated weight transforms what might otherwise be a straightforward action sequence into something that operates on a completely different register of intensity. When Cecilia fights in these scenes, you are not watching a protagonist engage a villain in the conventional thriller sense of those terms. You are watching a woman who has spent the entire film being acted upon finally act, and the release of that accumulated passivity into sudden, focused, physical agency produces a cathartic charge that is almost overwhelming in its intensity, precisely because the film has been so disciplined about withholding it for so long. Whannell understood that the third act action would only carry real weight if the first two acts had done the work of making the audience feel the full cost of what Cecilia was fighting against. And the first two acts did that work without compromise or shortcut. The result is a final confrontation that lands not just as spectacle but as emotional payoff, as the completion of a journey that the audience has been inside from the very first frame, and whose destination feels simultaneously inevitable and hard-won in a way that genuinely satisfying narrative conclusions almost never manage to be. The technical execution of the invisible suit sequences in this section of the film deserves specific and extended attention, because the visual effects work here is operating under a set of constraints that make it considerably more difficult than the standard superhero or science fiction approach to similar material. And the fact that it succeeds as completely as it does reflects an unusual degree of collaboration and discipline across every department involved in its production. The fundamental challenge of depicting an invisible character in physical conflict is that you cannot rely on the conventional grammar of action filmmaking, the coverage of two bodies in space, the readable geography of a fight, the visual confirmation of impact and consequence that allows an audience to track what is happening and feel the stakes of it in real time. All of that has to be reconstructed from scratch using a completely different set of tools. The distortion effects that represent the suit's presence, the subtle warping of light and air that betrays the outline of an occupied space, are calibrated with an extraordinary delicacy that reflects months of testing and refinement. Too obvious, and the invisibility loses its menace. Too subtle, and the audience loses the ability to track the physical geography of what is happening. The sweet spot between those two failure modes is narrow, and the visual effects team finds it and holds it across some genuinely difficult and complex sequences involving multiple moving elements in tight spaces. But the technical achievement, impressive as it is ultimately in service of something more important than spectacle. It is in service of keeping the audience inside Cecilia's experience rather than outside it as observers of a visual effects showcase. You are not watching the suit. You are feeling the presence behind it. And that distinction is everything. The moment where Adrian is unmasked, where the suit comes off and the physical reality of the man behind all of this is finally, fully visible, is staged with a deliberate lack of the dramatic weight that conventional thriller grammar would assign to a reveal of this magnitude. There is no slow motion. There is no dramatic musical punctuation. There is no lingering close-up designed to let the audience savor the villain's exposure. What there is instead is something more disquieting and more honest. A man, suddenly visible, who looks entirely ordinary. Not monstrous. Not transformed by his own cruelty into something visibly inhuman. Just a man, in a room, who has been doing what he has been doing because he could, and because nobody stopped him, and because the systems and structures around him were never designed with sufficient care to account for what people like him are capable of when given sufficient intelligence and sufficient resources and sufficient confidence in their own impunity. Oliver Jackson-Cohen has been almost entirely absent from the visible film up to this point. A voice, a presence, a shape in disturbed air, and his sudden full physical presence in the frame carries a specific kind of horror that is different in character from everything that has preceded it. The horror of the invisible man was the horror of the unseen. The horror of the visible Adrian is something colder and more familiar, the horror of looking at someone who has done everything this film has depicted and finding nothing in their face that adequately explains it. No visible madness. No readable monstrousness. Just a person. And somehow that is the most frightening thing the film has shown you. The confrontation between Cecilia and Adrian in this sequence is the film's most kinetically intense passage, and Whannell shoots it with a physicality and an urgency that represent a significant gear change from the slow, deliberate pacing that has characterized most of the film up to this point. That gear change is earned and intentional. The film has been operating at a low, sustained frequency of dread for so long that the sudden shift into kinetic, immediate, visceral action produces a genuine shock to the system that mirrors what Cecilia herself is experiencing in the moment. The camera gets closer. The editing gets faster. The sound design shifts from the subsonic, atmospheric unease of the earlier sections into something harder and more immediate, impacts that land with physical weight, movements through space that carry genuine consequence. The brutal acoustic reality of a confrontation that has none of the clean choreographic elegance of conventional action cinema. And in the middle of all of it, Moss is doing something extraordinary. She is playing fear and determination and grief and fury simultaneously, in a physical register, without allowing any single emotion to dominate the others, because the truth of what Cecilia is feeling in this moment is that all of those things are present at once and none of them can be separated from the others. She is not an action heroine in this sequence. She is a specific person, with a specific history, doing something that costs her something real, and every choice Moss makes in the staging and execution of the physical action reflects that specificity with a consistency and a commitment that elevates the entire sequence above the genre conventions it is working within. There are very few films that earn their endings completely, not just in the sense of narrative logic, of plot threads tied off and consequences delivered, but in the deeper sense of emotional truth, of a conclusion that feels like the only possible destination for everything the story has been building toward, that satisfies not just the mind but the part of you that has been living inside the experience alongside the protagonist for the entire runtime. The Invisible Man earns its ending completely. And the reason it earns it so completely is the same reason the film works as well as it does in every other department, because Whannell never loses sight of what the story is actually about underneath its genre mechanics, and the ending is constructed to resolve that deeper story rather than just the surface thriller plot. The surface plot resolution, Adrian defeated, Cecilia free, would be sufficient for a conventional horror film. It would close the loop, deliver the catharsis, send the audience home satisfied in the shallow but genuine way that competent genre filmmaking produces. But The Invisible Man is not interested in shallow satisfaction. It is interested in the specific and complicated truth of what survival actually looks like for a person who has been through what Cecilia has been through, and that truth is not simple, is not clean, and does not resolve into the uncomplicated triumph that the genre template would conventionally provide. What Cecilia gets at the end of this film is not freedom in the pure sense. It is agency. It is the reclamation of the right to determine her own circumstances rather than having them determined for her. And there is a profound difference between those two things that the film insists on maintaining right up to its final frame, a difference that is the source of both the ending's moral complexity and its emotional power. The dinner scene that precedes the film's climax is one of the most carefully constructed sequences in the entire film, and it operates on a level of dramatic and psychological complexity that rewards multiple viewings because the layers of what is happening within it only become fully visible once you know how it resolves. On the surface, it is a meal between Cecilia and Adrian, a performance of reconciliation, of the terms of their arrangement being normalized into something that looks, from a sufficient distance, like a relationship. Adrian is at his most controlled and most dangerous in these scenes, performing the reasonable, generous version of himself that presumably existed in the early stages of their relationship, the version that made Cecilia fall in love with him before the control became visible, before the architecture of the trap revealed itself fully. Oliver Jackson-Cohen plays this version of Adrian with a specific and unsettling charm, a warmth that is completely real on the surface and completely hollow underneath, a fluency with the performance of emotional connection that reflects someone who learned long ago that the most effective way to control another person is to make them feel, at least intermittently, genuinely loved. And Cecilia, across the table from him, is doing something equally complex. She is receiving that performance, responding to it in the ways he expects and needs her to respond, while simultaneously executing a plan that requires her to maintain the surface performance without allowing the plan underneath it to leak into her behavior in any way that Adrian's vigilant attention would detect. The scene is a duel between two people who are both performing, both watching, and both completely aware that the stakes of the performance are absolute. And the tension of it, the almost unbearable pressure of watching two such precisely calibrated performances held simultaneously in the same frame, is the film's final and most sophisticated deployment of the psychological intensity it has been building since its opening minutes. The moment Cecilia excuses herself from the table and moves through the house, the sequence of actions that constitutes the execution of her plan is handled with a narrative economy and a visual confidence that reflects everything Whannell has learned about pacing and restraint across the construction of this entire film. There is very little here that is not essential. Every shot is doing specific work. Every decision Cecilia makes is communicated with clarity and without redundancy. The plan itself, its mechanics, its requirements, its points of potential failure, is never explicitly spelled out in dialogue or internal monologue, which means the audience has to track it in real time through Cecilia's actions, which means the audience is inside her psychology in exactly the way the film has been training them to be since its first frame. You are not watching a plan being executed. You are inside the execution of a plan, feeling its tension and its contingencies and its narrow margins from the inside, which means when it works, the relief is not the passive relief of a spectator watching a positive outcome, but the active relief of someone who has been holding their breath for the last 10 minutes and has finally been given permission to exhale. That is the difference between a film that puts you in a seat and a film that puts you inside an experience. And The Invisible Man, in its final act, is decisively the latter. The final image of this film, Cecilia walking away from Adrian's house, away from the glass and the concrete and the architecture of control, into an open space that the camera holds without closing in, without the drifting, searching quality that has characterized so much of the film's visual language, is one of the most precisely calibrated final frames in recent American horror. Everything about it is intentional. The openness of the composition, after 2 hours of tight, claustrophobic, edge-scanning frames, carries a physical sense of release that operates below the level of conscious analysis. Your body feels the space before your mind processes its significance. The fact that Cecilia is walking away from the camera rather than toward it means the film ends without requiring her to perform anything for the audience, no final expression to read, no emotional state to interpret, no confirmation of how she feels about what she has just done. She is simply moving forward, away, through open space, on her own terms, without anything visible pursuing her. And the camera, which has spent this entire film treating empty space as a threat, finally allows empty space to be exactly what it appears to be. Just space. Just the absence of danger rather than the presence of something unseen. It is an ending that has been earned through every single frame that preceded it, and it lands with the quiet, devastating completeness of a story that always knew exactly where it was going and never once lost faith in the intelligence of its audience to follow it all the way there. There is a category of screen performance that does not get discussed as frequently or as precisely as it deserves to be. The kind where a single actor is required to carry the entire emotional and narrative weight of a film on their own, without the structural support of an ensemble, without the relief of scenes where another performance can absorb some of the audience's attention, without the ability to distribute the demands of the story across multiple characters in a way that allows any individual performance to breathe between its most demanding moments. It is the kind of performance where the film either works or it does not, entirely based on whether the actor at its center can sustain a level of psychological and physical commitment across the full runtime that most performers are only required to reach in isolated sequences. Elisabeth Moss in The Invisible Man is that kind of performance. And the reason it is worth dedicating specific and extended attention to what she does in this film, rather than simply noting, as most reviews did, that she is very good, is that the specific techniques and choices she deploys across this story represent a level of craft that is genuinely instructive about what screen acting at its highest level actually requires and actually looks like when it is being done with complete mastery. This is not a performance that announces itself. It does not have the dramatic monologues or the showpiece breakdown scenes that tend to attract awards attention and generate the kind of quotable critical praise that gets attached to acclaimed performances. What it has instead is something rarer and more difficult, a sustained, unbroken internal consistency that makes Cecilia feel like a complete and specific human being in every single frame she occupies, regardless of what that frame is asking of her, regardless of whether the scene is a major dramatic confrontation or a quiet moment of a woman sitting alone in a room and simply existing inside her own fear. The physical dimension of Moss's performance is where the film's most important work gets done, and it is worth being specific about what that means because physical performance in dramatic acting is frequently misunderstood as simply a matter of movement or gesture, of how an actor carries their body through space. What Moss is doing in The Invisible Man goes considerably deeper than that. She has constructed a complete physical biography for Cecilia, a set of bodily habits and default postures and automatic responses that reflect the specific history of a person who has spent years inside a controlling relationship and has developed, as a survival mechanism, a hypervigilance that has become so deeply embedded in her neurology that it operates below the level of conscious thought. The slightly elevated shoulder position that never fully relaxes even in moments of apparent safety. The quality of stillness she achieves in moments of threat, not the stillness of calm but the stillness of an animal that has learned that movement attracts attention. The way her eyes move through a room in a constant, low-level sweep that most people around her probably do not even register consciously, but that the camera, positioned with Whannell's characteristic attention to behavioral detail, catches and holds in a way that makes it available to the audience as ongoing information about Cecilia's internal state. These physical details are not decorative. They are not simply the surface texture of a well-researched performance. They are the primary mechanism through which the film communicates Cecilia's psychology to the audience, and they work because Moss maintains them with an absolute consistency across the entire runtime, never dropping the physical logic of the character even in scenes where the dramatic focus is elsewhere and a less disciplined performer might allow it to slip. The scenes where Cecilia is required to perform normalcy, to present a version of herself to the people around her that does not betray the full extent of what she is experiencing internally, are where Moss's technical control is most visible and most impressive. Performance within performance is one of the most demanding things that dramatic acting asks of a performer, because it requires the actor to simultaneously communicate two completely different states to two completely different audiences, the state the character is projecting to the other characters in the scene, and the state the character is actually in, which the film audience needs to be able to read clearly through and underneath the projected surface. Moss manages this without apparent effort across some of the film's most sustained and most complex sequences, including the dinner scenes with Adrian and the early conversations with James and Emily where Cecilia is trying to maintain enough surface coherence to preserve her relationships while internally managing a level of fear and certainty that has no outlet in those contexts. The technique she uses is not broad or telegraphed. She does not signal the internal state through the kind of obvious behavioral cues that less sophisticated screen acting tends to rely on. Instead, she works in the microregister, the fractional hesitation before a response that is slightly too controlled, the quality of a smile that is technically correct in all its surface elements but carries a weight in the eyes that does not match the expression below them, the specific way she holds her breath in moments where the performance she is giving requires a relaxation that her body cannot quite produce. These are details that register below conscious processing for most viewers, which means they work on the audience the way the film's sound design works on the audience, not as legible information but as felt experience, as a continuous undercurrent of unease that accumulates across the runtime without the viewer always being able to identify its precise source. What Moss does in the film's most physically demanding sequences, the confrontations, the moments of genuine terror, the scenes where Cecilia's controlled surface finally fractures under pressure that has exceeded its capacity to be managed, is where the performance becomes something that transcends craft and enters the territory of genuine artistic courage. The asylum sequence, the restaurant, the final confrontation with Adrian, These are scenes that require Moss to access and sustain emotional states of an intensity and a specificity that most performers, given the option, would find ways to modulate, to pull back from slightly, to manage at a safe distance rather than fully inhabiting. Moss does not pull back. She does not modulate. She goes completely into the experience of each of these moments with a commitment that is almost uncomfortable to watch, not because it is excessive or uncontrolled, but because it is so precisely calibrated and so fully inhabited that it stops feeling like performance and starts feeling like genuine human experience being captured on camera in real time. That quality, the quality of absolute presence, of a performer who is not representing an emotional state but actually occupying it at full intensity, is the rarest and most valuable thing that screen acting can produce. And it is the quality that makes The Invisible Man, which is already an exceptionally well-crafted film by every technical and directorial measure, into something that operates at a level above what its genre classification would typically suggest. Elisabeth Moss does not just carry this film. She transforms it, turns what could have been a very good thriller into a genuine study of human psychological endurance, delivered through a performance that deserves to be discussed alongside the finest work this generation of American screen actors has produced. There is a discipline in filmmaking that operates almost entirely below the threshold of conscious audience awareness, and that invisibility is precisely the measure of its success. Cinematography, at its most effective, is not something you notice. It is something you feel, a set of choices about light and space and movement and framing that shapes your emotional experience of a story without ever announcing itself as the mechanism doing the shaping. Most viewers who leave The Invisible Man with a sense of having been genuinely unsettled would struggle to articulate exactly how the film produced that effect. They would point to the story, to Elisabeth Moss, to the concept of the invisible suit, to the general atmosphere of dread that the film sustains across its runtime. Very few would point to Stéphane Duchio's camera work as the primary engine of their experience, despite the fact that it is arguably the single most important technical contributor to the film's success as a piece of sustained psychological horror. And that invisibility, the fact that the cinematography is doing its most important work in a register that most audiences do not consciously register, is not a limitation or an oversight. It is the entire point. Duchio and Whannell designed a visual language for this film that operates on the audience the way Adrian operates on Cecilia, below the surface of conscious awareness, shaping perception and emotional response through mechanisms that are deliberate and precise and almost impossible to identify without the specific intention of looking for them. Understanding what that visual language actually consists of, and how it produces its effects, is one of the most illuminating ways of understanding why this film works as well as it does, and why it continues to unsettle viewers in ways that outlast the immediate experience of watching it. The foundational choice that Duchio makes, the one that everything else in the film's visual language is built around, is the decision to treat empty space as a subject rather than a background. In conventional cinematography, the frame is organized around its subjects. The camera goes where the people are. Empty space is negative space, the absence of subject matter, the part of the frame that exists to give the subject definition and context rather than to carry meaning in its own right. Duchio systematically dismantles that convention from the film's opening minutes, and the dismantling is so gradual and so consistent that most viewers absorb its logic without ever consciously registering the departure from normative visual grammar that it represents. The camera drifts toward empty doorways. It holds on corners of rooms after characters have left the frame. It lingers in spaces where nothing is happening for fractionally longer than conventional coverage would justify, long enough to create unease without long enough to announce itself as a deliberate stylistic choice. Over the course of the film's first act, these small departures from conventional visual grammar accumulate into a completely internalized expectation in the audience, an expectation that empty space is not empty, that the absence of visible subject matter in a frame is not the absence of threat but potentially its presence. Once that expectation is established, Duchio can weaponize it with extraordinary efficiency. A single slow drift toward an unoccupied corner of a room carries the full weight of every previous drift, and produces a level of audience anxiety that is completely disproportionate to anything visible on screen. That is the mechanism. And it is one of the most elegant and most effective pieces of visual storytelling that contemporary Hollywood cinematography has produced. The lighting design in The Invisible Man works in close collaboration with the spatial grammar Duccio establishes. And it deserves specific attention because it is making choices that are unusual and precise in ways that reflect a thorough understanding of how light functions as a psychological instrument rather than simply an aesthetic one. The film's palette is built around a specific quality of cold, clinical illumination, the kind of light that reveals rather than flatters, that strips surfaces of warmth and texture and reduces everything to its functional visual information. Adrian's house, in the opening sequence, is lit in a way that makes it feel less like a home and more like a laboratory, every surface visible, every shadow controlled, nothing soft or ambient or accidental about the quality of light in any frame. That lighting logic carries a specific psychological implication that the film never states directly but that operates continuously as an undercurrent of the visual experience, the implication that this is a space designed for observation, for the precise monitoring of everything within it, for a kind of total visual control that is the spatial equivalent of the psychological control Adrian exercises over Cecilia. As the film moves into the spaces Cecilia inhabits after her escape, James's house, the facility, the outdoor environments, the lighting shifts subtly but meaningfully, introducing warmer tones and more ambient, less controlled illumination that signals the difference between Adrian's world and the world outside it. But crucially, those warmer spaces never feel fully safe. The camera's spatial grammar follows Cecilia into them and maintains its drifting, searching quality regardless of the lighting context, which means the audience's nervous system never fully accepts the warmth of the new environments as evidence of genuine safety. The lighting says you are somewhere different. The camera says the threat followed you. And the tension between those two signals is one of the primary sources of the film's sustained unease, the specific challenge that the invisible suit concept presents to the cinematography, and the specific solution that Duccio and the visual effects team developed in response to that challenge, is worth examining in technical detail because it represents one of the most elegant and most practically effective approaches to a genuinely difficult visual problem in recent mainstream filmmaking. The problem, stated simply, is this: how do you make an audience believe in and feel threatened by a presence that you cannot show them? The conventional answer, deployed across decades of invisible character films, is to use environmental displacement, objects moving, surfaces disturbed, the physical world registering the presence of something that the camera cannot directly capture. The Invisible Man uses this approach, but Duccio and Whannell add a layer to it that elevates it considerably above the conventional execution. The distortion effect that represents the suit, the subtle warping of light and air that occasionally betrays the outline of an occupied space, is calibrated with extraordinary precision to sit right at the edge of perceptibility. It is visible enough, on careful viewing, to confirm that something is there. It is subtle enough that on a first viewing, in real time, it operates primarily as a felt unease rather than a legible visual confirmation. This means the film is simultaneously delivering two different experiences to two different versions of its audience. First-time viewers feel the presence without being able to confirm it, which mirrors Cecilia's experience precisely, while repeat viewers can see the presence clearly and experience the retrospective horror of understanding exactly how many scenes contained something that the film was hiding in plain sight. That dual functionality, a visual effect that works differently depending on the attentiveness and the viewing history of the person experiencing it, is a remarkable achievement. And it reflects a level of intentionality and sophistication in the film's visual design that deserves far more recognition than it typically receives in discussions of what makes The Invisible Man work as well as it does. Every great genre film operates on two levels simultaneously: the surface level of story and spectacle, where it delivers the pleasures that its genre classification promises, and the deeper level of meaning, where it uses those surface pleasures as the vehicle for something that has genuine weight and genuine resonance beyond the immediate experience of watching it. The best horror films have always understood that the monster is never really the point, that the monster is a container for something else, something human and recognizable and often deeply uncomfortable, that the genre's conventions allow filmmakers to approach from an angle that realistic drama would struggle to access with the same directness or the same emotional impact. The Invisible Man understands this with a clarity and a commitment that places it in the company of the finest work the genre has produced across its entire history. The invisible suit is not the point. The jump scares, sparse as they are not the point. The thriller mechanics, as precisely executed as they are not the point. The point is what the film uses all of those elements to say about power and control and the specific experience of people, overwhelmingly women, who have lived inside relationships where those things were weaponized against them in ways that left no visible marks and produced no evidence that the systems designed to protect them were equipped to recognize or respond to. That is what this film is actually about. And the reason it works as well as it does, the reason it lingers in the mind long after its surface pleasures have faded, is that it says what it has to say with a precision and an honesty and a refusal to soften or simplify that is genuinely rare in mainstream studio filmmaking. The metaphor at the heart of The Invisible Man is not subtle, and it is not trying to be subtle. Whannell has been clear in interviews about the film's intentions, about the decision to remake the classic Universal property not as a monster movie but as a story about coercive control, about the experience of abuse survivors who are disbelieved and dismissed by the systems around them, about the specific and devastating form of psychological warfare that sophisticated abusers deploy against their partners. What is subtle? What reflects the real craft of the film's construction is the execution of that metaphor, the way it is embedded in every layer of the film's storytelling rather than sitting on the surface as a message to be delivered and received. The invisible suit is not a symbol that the film asks you to decode. It is a literal manifestation of something that already exists in the real world, the ability of a sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently resourced abusive partner to make themselves invisible to the systems and people that surround their victim while remaining completely and devastatingly present in that victim's life. The technology is fictional. The dynamic it represents is not. And by grounding its supernatural premise in that very real emotional and social reality, the film creates an experience that operates simultaneously as genre entertainment and as something that a significant portion of its audience will recognize at some level of their being as true. That recognition, the specific discomfort of seeing something you have experienced or witnessed or feared rendered with accuracy and without softening on a mainstream cinema screen, is the deepest source of the film's power. And it is the quality that will keep it relevant and unsettling long after its technical achievements have been surpassed and its specific cultural moment has passed. The conversation that The Invisible Man contributes to, the broader cultural conversation about coercive control, about the credibility of abuse survivors, about the institutional and social frameworks that consistently fail to protect people from the specific kind of harm this film depicts, is one that has been gaining visibility and urgency in American culture across the period in which this film was made and released. The film arrived in early 2020, in a cultural moment that had been shaped significantly by years of public reckoning with the prevalence and the institutional tolerance of abusive behavior by powerful men, a reckoning that had made the specific dynamics depicted in The Invisible Man more legible to general audiences than they might have been at an earlier point in the culture's development. That timing is not coincidental. Whannell has spoken about the film's origins in his response to that cultural moment, about wanting to make something that engaged seriously with the experiences that were being discussed in public discourse rather than simply using those experiences as background texture for conventional thriller. And the result is a film that feels, despite its genre framework, like a genuine contribution to that conversation rather than an exploitation of it. A film that uses the tools of mainstream horror not to sensationalize or to simplify but to make viscerally felt something that can be intellectually understood but is very difficult to fully inhabit from the outside without the kind of experimental translation that art at its best can provide. That is a meaningful achievement. In a cultural landscape full of films that gesture toward social relevance without doing the work to earn it, The Invisible Man does the work. It earns every claim it makes. And it does so in a way that never loses sight of its responsibility to the experiences it is representing, to the real people whose lives contain the truth that this film, in its best moments, manages to touch. What we are left with, after 15 chapters of analysis and breakdown and close attention to every layer of what this film is doing and how it is doing it, is a picture of a work that operates with a level of intentionality and craft and genuine artistic seriousness that its genre classification consistently undersells. The Invisible Man is not a great horror film despite being a horror film. It is a great film that happens to work within horror conventions. A film that uses every tool available to it, from the performances to the cinematography to the sound design to the structural architecture of its storytelling, in service of a vision that is coherent and humane and genuinely worth the sustained attention we have given it. Hey. Elisabeth Moss gave one of the defining screen performances of her generation. Leigh Whannell announced himself as a filmmaker of genuine vision and genuine substance. Stefan Duccio created a visual language for psychological dread that has already influenced the genre and will continue to do so. And together they made something that deserves to be remembered not just as a successful thriller or a smart remake, but as a film that understood its moment, honored the experiences at its center, and delivered them to a mainstream audience with a craft and an integrity that the subject matter demanded and completely received. If you have watched all 15 parts of this breakdown and you have not seen The Invisible Man recently, go back and watch it again. You will see it completely differently. And that is the highest compliment that film analysis can pay to any work, that understanding it more deeply makes the experience of it richer rather than diminishing the mystery that made it worth understanding in the first place. Drop in the comments which moment from this film stayed with you the longest, because after everything we have covered, that answer is going to be different for everyone. If this breakdown gave you something new to think about, the like button is right there, and it genuinely helps this kind of deep dive content reach the people who would appreciate it most. Now go watch it again.